Earlier this week, within our country, something happened that was surprisingly notable to me, or at least a bigger issue or deal than I might have otherwise thought. There was a political commentator, a media personality with a following who was shot, killed, assassinated, murdered. An awful event, a tragic event, a terrible event. And certainly any time that someone is struck down and killed, it meets that criteria. But I didn't quite realize what a big thing that would be because I'm, I guess, self absorbed. I assume you all are too. I haven't thought about it much, but I hadn't heard much about this man. I mean, I knew his name, Charlie Kirk. I knew his name, but I don't think I had ever actually heard anything he had ever said before, which, frankly, as someone that keeps up pretty regularly with politics and even podcasts, made me believe that, well, perhaps this will just be an unfortunate, tragic event that people will move past quickly. Boy, was I wrong. It turns out a lot of people know who he is. A lot of people loved him and followed him and listened to him regularly and faithfully. And a lot of people were deeply wounded and grieved by his killing, not just those close to him, but those who felt close to him. And there's a lot of people like that in our country right now, even if I didn't quite know who he was. And there's a lot of people that knew who he was, and frankly, they knew who he was because they didn't like him, which I guess is the nature of being a political media personality. You'll have people that really like you and people that dislike what you have to say. And there are, I don't know if in equal number, but there are just as many people who wanted to express their reactions to what had happened, and not with grieving and with the other things that you might expect in the wake of tragedy, but, well, with rancor, even hostility sometimes. And so, as you might imagine, there is this growing row, this rift, this group of people that are deeply aggrieved and wounded by this, who are not only aggrieved and wounded by the tragedy, but are now angry at the people that aren't, especially those who are, well, antagonistic towards the man who was killed. And there's people in that group that the more that this group remembers their person and perhaps occasionally over-remembers, that group, in some ways, becomes even more dug in, more vocal. And so I've been surprised over these last days that something that, when I first heard of it, I didn't think would be the big deal that it is, has turned into somewhat of a political moment in our country, perhaps even a historic moment. The question that always confronts us as Christians is, what do we do about it? How do we make sense of it? And even more importantly, how do we respond to it? And I think today, as we gather here on this Sunday in commemoration of the Holy Cross of Jesus, I think the cross has everything to tell us about how we respond to this and other things like this in our world and in our lives. And it might not be what you asked for when you got up to decided to come to church this morning, but I think the best way to explain this is through one of my pet passions, etymology. Etymology, E-T-Y-M-O-L-O-G-Y. Etymology. Etymology is the study of words. Quite literally, this eto is kind of getting down to the truth of something. And this logi at the end has to deal with logia in the Greek, which is the word for word. Same word that is used for Jesus when he is made incarnate and manifests in the Gospel of John. Etymology is figuring out what words mean. And this is important and came to mind for me because in the wake of this event, a lot of words became banted about more frequently than others. Two of them most notably, empathy and sympathy. Because Charlie Kirk had made a quote at one point where he sort of dismisses empathy. EMPATHY? Empathy? I think that's it. Empathy. Now, he talks about how empathy's a newer sort of thing, a new age thing, I think he calls it. And he's not exactly right and he's not exactly wrong. It is a newer term. It's only as old as the 20th century. You have the M, which comes from the Greek en, which kind of means in. And then you have pathy, which is pathos. And pathos is the state of feeling something or experiencing something. And so empathy is this response to events and specifically to people that allows you to be in with their feelings, to feel in with them, to walk in their shoes, as we might say, as an idiom for it. And so a lot of people who were expressing empathy in this matter were dismayed when people who were doing the opposite brought up this quote and said, "I will show this man as much empathy as he cared to show others." Now, it's always a little bit unfair to use quotes, even of those we don't like, if we take them out of context, because he actually continues on and he says, after his dismissal of empathy, that he prefers sympathy. I think I can get this one. SYMPATHY. Sympathy. Now, sympathy is much older than empathy. Sympathy, as far as we know, is, well, around since the time of the written language. Sym is actually sort of a change from sin in the Greek, SYN, which means together. We have something that we associate our Lutheran churches in called a synod, which means walking together. That's where the same root comes from. Together, and this pathy meaning the same thing, those feelings or experiences or emotions. And we know what sympathy is. Sympathy is, well, feeling with someone. So if someone is sad, you can have sympathy for them by feeling sad for them, or by them, or near them. Or if someone's happy, I suppose you could experience the same thing. But mostly the way that we use sympathy and empathy has to do with our emotional state, how we feel about something as individuals. I can experience empathy, I can express sympathy, but neither of those things necessarily cause us to do anything. I can feel bad for you, and I can let you know in the midst of your suffering, I feel bad for you, and hopefully that's helpful for you, but maybe it won't be. And I can feel happy for you, and I can even experience that empathetically with you, and maybe that means something, maybe it doesn't. Sympathy and empathy are very sort of self-interested and self-centered things. And it's not unfair to say that Jesus on the cross doesn't experience both of these for us. I am sure and I believe he does. Jesus is sympathetic to our state and cares for us. That's part of the reason that he makes himself manifest. And quite literally, in a sense, then, he is empathetic. He knows what it's like to walk in our shoes. This is the great promise of the incarnation and crucifixion, that Jesus understands what it is to walk like us in this world. But the cross doesn't have power just because Jesus feels these things, thinks these things. Nor would I say that we necessarily have what we need to meet a world that is often suffering and hurting with empathy or sympathy alone. Pietas, or pietas, I should say, if my Latin was better, is a word that might sound familiar. I gave a sermon during Lent that talked about Jesus' feet. That might bring it back to you, because I was talking about the statue known as La Pieta. Well, this is the Latin root for that Italian word. Pietas is a very interesting word because it has to do with duty and response. Pietas is that feeling and expression of duty that makes itself manifest when you are obliged to perform something within your family because they're your family, or within your community because they're your community, or just towards someone else because you have to. Duty, a reverent duty, is pietas. And pietas becomes the grandfather of other words. two other words. One which, well, actually, I think both of them we look somewhat askance at, unfortunately. The first one is this: piety. Pietas branches off and becomes piety. Now, piety has gotten a bad rap as people being overly pious. Oh, they just want to show off. But piety is this deep inner devotion and duty to worshiping God. From that pietas, that we have a responsibility to do something in our relationship towards God, and that is expressed through our piety. Second to that, and a word which I think is much more scorned even, is pity. In fact, it's so lightly used anymore that every time that I have tried to write it down in my phone or on my computer, it keeps correcting to P-I-T-T. I think it's reading some of my other messages. You don't have to have pity on everyone. Now, pity also comes from this pietas, but what's different about pity is we often now use it as a pejorative. Oh, I'm taking pity on that person. Oh, don't have pity on me. What does it mean for us? That I'm looking down at someone, that I'm feeling bad for someone. That's not the nature of this at all. Still rooted in the duty, and specifically the duty to respond to one's suffering. But different than sympathy and empathy, while pity can be accompanied by those things, pity doesn't actually require them. It doesn't matter how you feel about another person who is suffering, your pity demands that you do something about it and for them. There's something good about pity. Now, I think for both of these things in the cross of Jesus, he demonstrates them both clearly. There is piety. There is duty, reverent duty that he shows to God the Father. In that night before his crucifixion, when he prays in anguish and prays that the cup be taken from him, but offers that if it is God's will, it will be done. He's dutiful to God in the cross. But I think he also shows this: pity. And remember, we don't like to be pitied, do we? Except that pity carries with it that compulsion to do good for those who are suffering, even if you don't like them. Now, there's a number of ways we could understand Jesus in this moment, but I think maybe most perfectly we could understand it through those two people crucified next to him, to his right and to his left. One of them, the bad criminal as he's called, keeps mocking Jesus with contempt. And the good criminal asks Jesus to remember him when he comes into his kingdom, and he believes. And Jesus responds to him that today you will be with me in paradise. But he dies for both of them, just as he dies for all those in the crowd who had shouted, "Crucify him, crucify him." Now, I'm not going to ever say that Jesus doesn't love someone, but I might wager a guess that he did not like them very much at that moment. Pity becomes for us the vehicle to not only understand the cross, but to understand our duty as Christians. And our duty as Christians is lived out through charity. It's the response to that pity. Someone is suffering, someone is in need, and I will do something for them, no matter who they are, no matter what. That's real charity. And charity is, for better and worse, a word that was substituted for another word. Part of this whole language thing. When charity was introduced into the Bible, it was introduced by St. Jerome, more or less, as a translation for the word agape, which we'll get to in a second. But charity comes from what St. Jerome used in translating to Latin the word caritas. And caritas, other than just transliterating it as charity, means something of giving oneself to another. Our piety doesn't necessarily demand that we sympathize or empathize with anyone, but our piety drives us to charity. And charity, in caritas, in Jerome's understanding of agape, is self-sacrificial. And in this, In this, Jerome actually gets it right. Because the Greek word that he's translating is agape. And agape is a great word. In fact, Greek does much better with these words than we do in English, because agape you will find most often translated as love, at least in newer English versions. It used to be translated as charity, but we replaced it with this catch-all word that we use for love, because we love so many things. Jesus loved us from the cross, but you can also love a sandwich that you had yesterday for lunch. It's a little bit too big a word, isn't it? But this agape is more specific. This is one of the 4 at the time Greek words that is used for love that is completely and totally about self-sacrificial love. And not the love of desire, not the love of affection even, but a love that places someone else above you, no matter what. But you can blame it on the Germans. Why not? We're in a Lutheran church. That's where love comes from. But the German word that filters its way down to English of love really is more about those affections, those things that we think of lovey-dovey sort of love. It holds less of that agape in it, and that's unfortunate. Because love and agape and this whole relationship we have with the world is vitally important when it comes to Jesus telling us to love a specific group of people, to love our enemies. That is Jesus' great agape instruction of love, because it earns you nothing, he says, to love your friends and your neighbors, but your enemies. And this word I love. See, I'm using it too broadly. But enemy comes from in the Latin, which means not. This part here comes from amicus. So in amicus is enemy in the Latin. And so it is not friend, quite literally. But even more than that, the root of friend, amicus, in the Latin is amare, love. When Jesus says to love your enemies, he is in one way saying, as far as the languages would tell us, that you are to love those whom you cannot love. That is true agape, which differs from affection, as we've mentioned. Now, affection can be the basis for a great many forms of love, and I think affection is required for things like sympathy and empathy towards others. Because affection is your state of mind and what you are doing. That's the 2 words that are sandwiched together here. And in classical use, affection was only used in one of 2 ways. It was the affection that you held towards God, your true love and devotion of God, or it was the affections of the body and the soul, those things that drew you away. What will you love more? And imposing that dichotomy between the 2, we can almost begin to better understand what Jesus is telling us in that command to love our enemies. We can better understand the cross. Jesus loves from the cross an agape love towards the world because of his affectionate piety that he has for God the Father, not those who crucify him. But affection speaks to our passions. And what are we passionate about? And we use this word modernly in English to talk about those things that, well, really get us going. Passion is what drives our emotional core. Passion is that thing that gives us a sort of zest to do something or believe something. It's that motivating factor. And we use it completely wrong. Because the word passion didn't originally mean that. But you can see why it turned into that. Has anyone ever heard that term, the passion of the Christ, and wondered, why is it like that? Because passion meant suffering. Because what drove our healing and reconciliation, what was borne out in great anguish of Christ's love for us on the cross, was his own passion. And so then we as Christians are called to be people of compassion. People who not only enter into care as we talk about it now, but people who will enter into suffering for the sake of another. And that suffering, literally for Jesus, metaphorically for us, takes place on the cross. Now, the cross, or crux in the Latin, really just kind of meant the thing of the cross. And they'd use it other ways sometimes too, but sometimes they used it to talk about an instrument of torture. Sometimes they just used the word to talk about a pole with an intersecting pole attached to it. But as time went on, they also started to use it a little bit more metaphorically, this word cross. Not because the cross of Jesus necessarily means something to them yet, but because cross does involve that intersection of things. And so, as they started to use it throughout the Roman Empire, the cross began to mean something of a puzzle, a riddle. This is the crux for them, that they're trying to figure something out because maybe they have these two things that just don't match up and intersect. That's the way that they thought about crux, the cross. For us, however, we have gone back to the Latin, because we still talk about the cross of Jesus, and when we talk about the cross, we usually mean the cross. But then we came up with this other word, crux, which is the Latin for cross. And when we talk about crux, what we're talking about is the crux of the matter. It's the thing that is essential, the thing that is most important, the thing that makes it all work. And so we grow that term crux, just as the French did. And we talk about something being crucial. And something that is crucial, when the French started talking about it, had something to do with intersecting, the intersecting of ideas, when they talked about crucial. And as we adopted this same crux-based language, this same cruciform word into our own language, we began to use it as a term to describe something at the crossroads. The crucial decision we make is when we are at the crossroads. And that's our final word for today. Still finding the cross in it, but asking ourselves, much like that own synodical language, where the cross will lead us. Because we are at a crossroads. And it's not the only time we'll be at one in our life as individuals and as community together in this whole big thing that we live in called society, but we are at a crossroads where you can decide which way you will go. The choice is still yours. Will you choose the way of piety, charity, and agape love in meeting a world that can be filled with your inimicus out there, your enemies? Will you greet them the same way that Christ greets us on the cross? Not out of like, but out of love, so to speak. Or will you wait for sympathy and empathy to win the day? Do you have to feel a certain way about someone to love and care for them? Do you have to believe a certain thing about someone to love and care for them? Because more often than not, that's kind of where we start and finish the question. Are they deserving? Are they good enough to receive my love, my affection? Because our affections can lead us to God, but our affections can also lead us to the passions of the soul, the mind, and the body, and away from holy things. And at this crossroads, at this decision point that you have faced before and you will face again, the question becomes, will you go the way of the cross or another way altogether? Because the way of the cross is a bumpy road. The way of the cross is the way of pity and charity and agape and self-giving. And the way of the cross quite literally leads to the cross. And for us, that cross is everything, even and especially when it doesn't make sense. In today's epistle, it is put plainly and perfectly. The wisdom of this world is turned upside down by that very thing. And the decisions laid before us as a cruciform people, as a people shaped by the cross and saved by the cross, those decisions are nothing less than a choosing of God or something else. Because it doesn't really matter what we think about the world. It doesn't matter how much we have affection for others. To put it plainly in the modern English, it doesn't matter if you like them. Because the cross isn't about that. It's about love, which is something wholly different and wholly better and holy in and of itself. Amen.